Welcome everyone to IBA's Lease End Forecast webcast on this Friday, 31st May 2019. Myself, Mike Yeomans, Head of Valuations at IBA, and Dr. Stuart Hatcher, the Chief Operating Officer at IBA, are going to talk you through some important trends in lease ends. We'll be showing a lot of data from our online IBA.iQ system and talking about some hot topics and aircraft families and how lease ends are going to play out for those over the next couple of years. So I will pass over to Stuart, who will kick off on some trends we're seeing in lease ends.
Well, thanks, Mike. So if we move to slide number 2, and particularly looking first of all at the leasing activity in 2019 so far, there has been a big push on lease ends. If you look at the chart there, the airline failure chart, which we've been presenting for the last couple of months, there has been a steady increase at the beginning of the year, but a sudden rise with Jet Airways Avianca Brazil early returns. Now, so far, we've hit 572 lease end events already, which is, when you compare it, say, to 2018, it's not a particularly large increase per se, but when you look at 46% of that has been taken up by the COs, NEOs, NGs, and a couple of MAX aircraft as well, which have also been lease turned already. Just those alone were 265 lease ends. Compare that to last year when it was close to 36% and 204. Now, also, when you look particularly at some of the finer details, 94 of those have been 737-800s already returned, which is pretty much 95% of the entire 2018 total. Again, Jet Airways being a major culprit of that. When you look at the other aircraft, A320s, 330s, 777s, they've generally so far been running at expected rates, although some 777s coming from Jet will increase that level. Looking at what lease ends in relating to the world fleet, it's around, we do expect around 7% of the narrow body fleet to start new leases, and wide body is still around about 5% is the long-term trend. Moving over to the next slide, looking just at the lease starts, they're generally following a long-term average. Last year was a bit of a peak, but it's come back down to the long-term average when you look at it so far from a January to May, like for each year. And it does low, but last year was particularly high. By this point, there was a particular strong push in the market. So far, 381 lease starts involved the COs, NEOs, NGs, and MAXs, versus around 510 this time round last year. But that's naturally down due to some MAX issues there. But that still remains close to the long-term average. Now, despite the lack of MAX activity, 2019 is down clearly on the 2018 trend as well, but you know, it's nothing necessarily to be worried about on that specifically. On the upside, 209 of the aircraft that have been returned have actually already gone back out onto release already. Lessors have been particularly quick at placing those distressed returns, and SpiceJet have even launched a business class offering to take advantage of some of those interiors. Typically for lease starts, we expect around 3.2% for the narrow body fleet to lease end to go into lease starts, and 2.1% of the wide body fleet on that too. Now, moving over to the starts versus ends on the next chart. The ratio of start over end continues to shift from a long-term trend, which is normally around, it's now getting close to 1-to-1, where it has been in the past around 2-to-1. And you can see on the two charts there, the chart on the left and the chart in the middle there, and you can see obviously on different axes there, but you can clearly see the relationship, just how many end events there have been already in the first 5 months of the year. And the far right hand chart there, you can see the positions over a long period of time over the last 15 years, how turboprops and regionals have been fairly steady in their activity, whilst the narrow body and wide bodies have seen a sharp closing of the gap between starts and ends. Now, moving over to the next one, and the parking activity, we've certainly seen an increase. There is, as you can see there, the seasonal relationship, but the NGs have significantly increased owing to Jet Airways, where we had from around 100 aircraft, and these are stacked charts rather than straight on top of one another. and we're now around about 200 aircraft in just a few months. But of course, if these aircraft are going to be placed within 2019, a large number of them will be, then that balance should be restored, but it will affect the lease end activity greatly to that number. Looking just briefly at the wide bodies, the 777s are now leading the pack with 114, A330s around about 98, which make up the bulk, and obviously we're starting to see a steady return to service of those 787s with Rolls engines. Now moving actually over onto the new lease end forecast. So the two charts we see there, one is for all narrow bodies, the other one is for all wide bodies, and we can see there with the light blue is what we know, the dark blue is the new forecast, and the red line is what the previous original forecast was from last year. And as you can see right across the board, we have seen a significant increase in there. Clearly that lease extensions, which will happen, are not factored into here. These are purely from the effect of contractual effect, but we're naturally going to see some of those in there. Now, why have they got so large? Of course, we're seeing that with the narrow body particularly, we have seen a downward trend since 2012 of the number of lease ends, when in fact the leasing market has been growing. And there's many factors in here, whether it's lower oil price has spurred many airlines to keep aircraft for longer, or they're not so trusting of the reliability of new equipment. But there are many different factors in there. But generally speaking, passenger demand has been increasing, the fleets have been increasing, but airlines have been happy to keep aircraft for much longer. We have seen extensions in the past much greater than 50%. A few years ago, we saw 80% of extensions, which was incredibly high, very hard to track prior to them actually happening, but it's something we constantly keep a very close eye on. The wide body trend is a little bit stranger. We have a bit of a peak in 2015 and then a significant drop off, and that was with really the oil price dropping. We saw many aircraft being kept on for much longer and avoiding that reconfiguration cost. Now I will look very briefly at some of the more liquid types, and looking at the CO Neo NG Maxes versus the 330s, 777-8s, 350s, and the 380s. Very much similar sort of pattern there for the narrow bodies, as we've seen with the entire market, but that's not surprising considering those aircraft types consume the vast majority of that fleet. So not much more really to speculate on that, except last year where we were looking at more of a peak over the next 4 years. We have seen a greater number of extensions appearing in that 23, 24, 25, and 26 region, as longer extensions have occurred, which is where you get this considerable backup. On the more liquid wide body side, you can see that it's more of a gradual increase, and that's just as the fleet is growing and as the leasing side is gaining greater appetite. Now, of course, what more extensions will also create, and also these lease ends will create, is a more of a stronger part out and conversion market. And if we flip over to the next slide, just to recap on the retirements that we were looking at the beginning of the year, age of retirement we've seen has been creeping up, pretty much zero growth between 2012 and 2017, with a sudden spike in 2018 for those narrow bodies. I mean, realistically, the MRO market itself is incapable of handling the contractual lease ends as they stand for the narrow bodies. There's simply too many coming back. So certainly we have seen some acceptance of less optimal aircraft between leases, and we've seen some pretty quick lease returns and releases to try and take advantage of that summer season and some of the panic from the airlines to get more equipment in the light of the MAX. But generally speaking, you know, we're going to see some strains on that MRO market if these lease ends do continue. Clearly, the demand for parts continues in there as well, and that will maintain that aging fleet will continue. Engines remain in considerable demand, and operators are continuing balancing old and new equipment. So what we do expect is that retirements will suddenly start to increase, and likewise, same for conversions. So I'll now hand over to Mike to look at a few more aircraft types individually.
Thanks, Stuart. So first, I'd like to have a look at the A330 market, just to give a brief overview of what's happening there. We know it's it's an aircraft family that there's a lot of interest and from some a lot of concern into the secondary market performance. You know, we have seen some pressure on values and lease rates of these aircraft in recent times, so important to have a look at what we expect to come onto the market in terms of leased assets over the next couple of years. Recently, the main model that's been available has been the 330-200. You can see the bottom left side of the chart that pre GFC, the 200 accounted for the majority of the deliveries. So those aircraft coming back from their first leases has accounted for a lot of the availability of that aircraft type. If we look on the right-hand side of the chart, you can see where the lease placements have been. The sort of fleet demographics, this geographical spread for the 200 is fairly even, but when you look at the secondary placements, Europe accounts for the vast majority of those placements. When you look at the 300, there's been much fewer number of aircraft come onto the market so far, but there's most of the placements there have been again in Europe and also in Asia Pacific, but the 300 has always been a more popular aircraft in Asia, so that no surprises there that Asia has accounted for those secondary lease placements really. The 300s in the secondary market we've seen going to the likes of Brussels Airlines, we've seen Thai Air Asia X, Air Canada taking some of those aircraft. The 200s, quite a number have gone into Turkey. We've also seen Malaysian take some aircraft as they're moving away from the 300s into the 200s. And Russia has also been a sort of popular source of demand for those aircraft. We'll have a look now at the lease end analysis and see what we expect to happen over the next few years. And you can see the dotted line, as in some of the slides that Stuart was showing, that's the previous forecast that we had for the upcoming lease ends. And you can see we have upgraded our assessment of how many aircraft are coming off lease in terms of both the 200 and 300 models over the coming years. We've highlighted here which operators we're expecting to see aircraft come back from. So for the 300, Singapore Airlines has the largest number over the next couple of years, and those are relatively young aircraft. They were taken on short sort of 6-year lease terms, and what we're expecting to see is, you know, not a real large premium for those aircraft in terms of the lease rates than some of the older aircraft, you know, such as the current availability and storage position. As Stuart highlighted, there's a large number of these aircraft available, so we can't see operators paying that much of a premium for these sort of 2014, circa 2013, 14 aircraft than say, you know, a 2009, 10 aircraft. For the 330-200, the lease ends, mainly the largest is Turkish Airlines. We might see some aircraft come back from there. Air Europa, we know that they've recently announced that they're going to be replacing 330s with 787-9s that they're taking. So you can expect to see aircraft come back off lease from Air Europa over the next 2 to 3 years as well. We have to be clear that not all of these figures will result in lease returns. You know, there will be some extensions mixed in there, and Air France is one of the carriers we'd expect to see extending those leases. So next we're going to have a look at the 777 and specifically the 777-300ER. We'll focus on that aircraft, as that's another type that we know lessors are interested in, and there's some concerns as to how those aircraft are going to perform going forward in terms of their residual values and their release rates. There is a high concentration amongst these the carriers with these aircraft. Obviously, Emirates has a very large fleet. The rest of the sort of top 5 or 10 carriers have large fleets of over 30 aircraft in many cases. And we've already seen Emirates returning some aircraft, Cathay as well, they've A350-1000s on order, so we expect to see aircraft coming back from Cathay as well. When we look at where the aircraft are going, or where they've been going so far, the secondary placements have been largely into Russian carriers. We've seen the Russian carriers performing well, relatively strong ruble, sort of good connectivity within Russia, and the lower airfares that are being offered has sort of stimulated a lot of traffic growth in the area, and we've seen that translate into more aircraft going into Russia from the secondary market. I'd say about 80% of these 300ER lease placements have gone into Russian carriers. So Rossiya, Azure, Nordwind, Royal Flight, all Russian carriers there. And there's more aircraft due to go into those carriers over the coming months. So when we look at the lease end analysis for the 777, there are perhaps some concerning trends here. Looking at the number of aircraft with lease ends in 2019, we have increased quite significantly since our previous forecast the number of lease ends in 2019. Now, as I mentioned before, not all of those aircraft are going to result in redeliveries, but we can expect to see more aircraft coming into the market, particularly the Jet Airways aircraft, where those aircraft are in the process of being extracted from Jet Airways, and we can expect to see those aircraft being offered around the market imminently. And there's obviously 7 there that we've highlighted coming out this year. Emirates, a large number again. We maybe won't see all of those aircraft coming back, but we probably will see more aircraft coming back out of Emirates. Whereas the likes of Air France, we have seen some extensions of Air France 777, so we might see some of those aircraft stay. But we're certainly expecting to see an increase in availability of 777-300ERs over the course of this year and into next year. And given the fact that we've seen some pressure on the lease rates, and we have seen lease rates decline over the last year or two, we can probably expect that trend to continue. Okay, so moving now on to the Boeing 737NG lease end analysis. Similarly to the other aircraft types, we have increased our forecast in terms of the number of aircraft with lease ends over the coming years. Much like the A330 and 777, there is large exposure from Jet Airways in terms of the 737-800 aircraft and a couple of 737-700. It's important to note that in this chart and in the preceding charts, the Jet Airways figures represent aircraft that are still to be taken back from the carrier by their lessors. So we're not including any aircraft that have already been extracted. Of course, the Jet Airways fleet of 800s was much larger than 19 aircraft, but there are still 19 still to be extracted. In terms of the demand for those aircraft, the 737-800s of course at the moment in popular demand, particularly with the grounding of the 737 MAX family of aircraft. So aircraft that are in a reasonable maintenance condition and can be transitioned easily should find placement relatively quickly. We'll look now at the A320ceo lease end analysis. Across the board, really, we have increased our forecasts for these aircraft as well. In terms of the specific models, we have increased our A319 lease end forecast for 2019. We're expecting a larger number of lease ends to come up this year, although not all will result in lease ends or in actual returns of the aircraft. The highest operator in terms of the number of lease ends here is American Airlines with 30, but we know that American has been taking aircraft from the secondary market for A319s. We're not really expecting to see those aircraft coming back. We'll probably see them hold on. Siberia Airlines as well, S7, the strong performance in the Russian market, we can expect to see those aircraft staying in there. Indigo, in terms of the A320s, got the largest number of lease ends forecast. but given obviously the failure of Jet and some capacity there to take up some of the Jet traffic, we might see some of those aircraft stay in. Given that there's 48 with NEOs delivering, we may see some returns as well. So perhaps a combination for that carrier. So I'll pass back to Stu, who's going to offer some conclusions on our presentation.
All right, thank you very much, Mike. So just to conclude, the main headlines being big push on lease ends, retirement's up, but the lease starts are still progressing. Clearly, the 800 is still continuing to make up a large proportion of the lease return, but some have been placed very quickly with operators like SpiceJet. So clearly there are opportunities out there. Airline failures, though, are still expected to rise, which will boost those early returns. However, we still have the summer season on the doorstep, so we're hoping that will be put to bed some aspects of those failure numbers. There are clearly going to be a large number of extensions still on the cards, especially due to the MAX issue. We still don't know a definitive time when that aircraft will be back. We've seen many reports that it could be anywhere between now right through the summer period, and even some situations where it's much towards the end of the year. But extensions will be obviously key for addressing those short-term summer demands. As Mike showed, the 777-300ER returns will be peaking in 2019 with over 30, and that's clearly going to be a concern to see how that market plays out. And a decent number of A330 returns on the horizon, although a previous track record of placements is pretty good, albeit at low yields. As already presented, part outs and conversions are expected to receive a new wave of feedstock, so many of those guys will be quite happy. And generally on the pricing side, CMVs are therefore expected to decline on older types and for aircraft that are being parked in large numbers. That is, unless oil peaks and the secondary demand for current technology rebounds and the MAX comes back into play sooner than expected. Maturity of the releasing placement market will gather pace for many lessors and feed a better intel on those loss given default costs. I mean, certainly one thing, questions we've received many times is how much does it cost to repossess and release an aircraft, especially a wide body. And the coming months, we will get a great deal of new information, which will see how easy or hard those situations have become, or realistically, just how much of a reconfiguration a new operator is prepared to go through. As already alluded, MAX return is expected at some point during the summer months, which will feed the lease end events for the next few years if airline fleet plans become a little bit more conservative, which is what we're expecting to see. Consequently, lease rentals are not really set to increase if these lease ends do progress as planned, unless aircraft are removed from the system. If these aircraft that are coming out are not really airworthy and not really in demand by other airlines, then we will start to see that solidifying. But generally, with everything like this, we are constantly reevaluating the extension position as this forecast will move as multiple scenarios play out.
Thanks very much, Stuart. So that concludes our presentation on lease ends for today. If anyone has any queries or any questions following on from the webcast, please feel free to get in touch with either of us, either through our marketing email, our website, or our email addresses are on the front page of the presentation. Thanks very much. Goodbye.